You can read a lot into a face, not just about our emotions, but who we are and where we come from.
Look in the mirror, and it's thousands of years of history that look back at you. Written into our facial features is a story going back countless generations. It's a story of migration and integration, of conquest and war.
We look as we do because of our genes. Genes that have been handed down over thousands of years through countless generations. In this series, we'll be giving the results of the biggest ever genetic survey of Britain. For the first time, we'll know the true ancestry of the British regions. The survey promises some remarkable answers and big surprises in revealing who we really are.
I'll be meeting famous faces and ordinary people to find out how many of us are descended from ancient Celts, Anglo-Saxon farmers, Viking warriors, and Norman invaders. As an archaeologist, I'm fascinated by piecing together evidence that helps explain who we are and where our ancient ancestors came from. And as this series has gone on, it's been amazing to discover just how many clues to our ancient past can be found in the DNA of ordinary Britons. I'm intrigued by the idea that those ancient peoples passed on their genes and influenced the way we look.
Genetic science has opened up a whole new branch of archaeology, and one of the pioneers of this new discipline is the eminent geneticist Sir Walter Bodmer. In a mammoth project, Sir Walter and his team of scientists at Oxford University are collecting DNA samples from thousands of volunteers all over the country. It's a study which could rewrite the history of Britain.
Our aim is to understand what we call the genetic structure of the population. We know historically that there were different contributions, and we know that from history, but that often tells us only about the rulers, the main people. It doesn't tell us about how many people came, what really was the composition of the populations, how is that reflected in modern day terms, and we can answer that through looking at the DNA.
In effect, Sir Walter is creating a DNA map of Britain, a kind of genetic doomsday book, which reveals just how Celtic, Anglo-Saxon or Viking we really are. And to help interpret the DNA results, I'm travelling Britain with Sir Walter's team, looking at the archaeological record, regional dialects and other clues. So far, the study has revealed that people in Devon, Cornwall and southwest Wales are descended from the hunter-gatherers who first settled Britain about 10,000 years ago. On the east coast, it's a different picture. Here, the population is overwhelmingly Anglo-Saxon, carrying DNA brought over in the 5th and 6th centuries from Denmark and Germany. Now Sir Walter is on the hunt for the legendary Norse Vikings, who came in their longboats in the 9th and 10th centuries. The question is, to what extent did they leave their mark on the British bloodline? Are descendants of the Vikings living among us today? To find out, Sir Walter's team is heading north, to one of the most remote spots in Britain, where, 1200 years ago, the Vikings launched a series of devastating attacks. For the Vikings, the Orkney Islands were ideally placed, between their Norwegian homeland, their new colonies in Iceland and Greenland, and the coastlines which they regularly plundered, in Ireland and the west of Britain.
The Orkneys were the longest-held Norse stronghold in the whole of Britain. Amazingly, they remained part of the Norwegian-Danish kingdom well into the 15th century. And at that point, they were given to Scotland, believe it or not, as part of a royal wedding dowry. So there's every chance that Orcadians alive today will have Viking blood running in their veins.
But here we hit upon a problem, which generations of historians have struggled in vain to answer. When the Vikings took over, what happened to the native Picts, the Celtic tribes who were already living here?
I want to see if the Viking immigrants settled peacefully with the locals, or did they wipe them out? And I also want to know if the Viking men came alone, or did they bring their women with them?
The answer to these questions is locked inside the genes of the modern-day Orkney Islanders. Islanders like Jean Flett, who has volunteered her own DNA for the study. Jean's surname, Flett, is a Norse Viking word meaning farmstead and is a remarkably common Orkney name.
Jean, it looks to me as though just about every other name on a gravestone is Flett. Just how long have your lot been here?
According to this book, we've been here at least since 1137. The records of the Earldom of Orkney.
Earldom of Orkney?
Yeah.
Torkel Flett?
Yeah.
A chieftain of Earl Paul. Slain 1137?
Yes, so we were here before that.
Let's go back to the 12th century there.
Oh, yes.
Given how much you know about your history, and it goes back such a long way, what more are you hoping for from the genetic test results?
Well, I hope it'll prove what it says in this book.
But they were a rotten lot.
Oh, yes.
You want connection to that?
Yeah.
Bunch of baddies that arrived here.
Oh, yes. It's my history. I have to take it, accept it.
Jean can trace her family back to the Earls of Orkney, the mythical warrior kings in the Orkney Inga saga. She's even got a name, Torkel Flett, slain in 1137. I want to know more about him.
The problem with names is that they point at best to only the male half of your distant ancestry. Jean may well be the distant offspring of some cutthroat Viking pirate, but who was his mate? Was she a Viking carried over on the longboats, or was she a local Pict? Hidden in Jean's DNA is the answer to questions which have long fascinated ancient historians. Did the marauding Viking men bring their women with them, or did they force themselves on the wives and daughters of the Picts? And what fate befell the Pictish men? As I look out across the timeless hills and inlets of the Orkney Islands, it isn't hard to imagine a Viking longboat ominously making its steady progress towards the shore. Ancient history here is close enough to touch. I'm in Orkney to see how far the genes of Norse Vikings live on in the people who live here today. Oxford geneticist Sir Walter Bodmer is testing the DNA of the locals to solve a historical puzzle. Did the Vikings who invaded these islands more than 1,000 years ago bring their own women? Or did they take by force the wives and daughters of the local Picts? And if they did, what then happened to the Pictish men? It will take several weeks for the DNA results to come through, so in the meantime, I want to look at some historical clues. One of the DNA volunteers, Jean Flett, believes she's descended from a legendary Viking, Torkel Flett. He's mentioned in the Orkney Inga saga, a medieval text chronicling Norse rule on Orkney. Local historian Sarah Jane Gibbon picks up the story.
What it says is, you can see here, Thorkel Flettier het Bundi I Vestry, Odel o Mikkelhefer.
And that means?
It means that Thorkel Flettier was a farmer in Westry and that he was quarrelsome and overbearing.
And so to be mentioned by name, does that mean that Thorkel Flett was somebody who mattered?
Because his name is mentioned, we know he's quite important. And he's mentioned at the very end of his life because he was actually burned in his house. So he had a rather violent end.
The Orkney Inga saga says much about the Viking dynasties who once ruled Orkney. But what befell the Picts, the Celtic farmers who were the original inhabitants of these islands?
The Orkney Inga saga doesn't mention anything about the people who were there before the Vikings.
Do you think it was some kind of year zero? I mean, did the Vikings come in and sweep everything away?
The fact that there's no pre-Norse place names in Orkney and the fact that the culture is so unbelievably Scandinavian would suggest that any population that were here must have been overcome or chased out or killed.
The Scottish Picts were one of the Celtic tribes descended from the hunter-gatherers who first settled Britain 10,000 years ago, when we were still connected to Europe by land. Legend describes the Picts as short, even pygmy-like. They were small, but they were brutes according to the Romans, who had to build an immense wall to keep the little blighters out. So when the strapping great Vikings arrived, did they settle down alongside the runty Picts, or did they slaughter them? While Sir Walter's team analyses the DNA, I'm off in search of some less high-tech archaeological evidence. Here at the Broch of Bursay, we find the ruins of a Pictish settlement which fell into Viking hands. Archaeologist Julie Gibson is trying to work out what happened here.
It looks as though they saw themselves as being fairly warlike.
Yes.
I mean, they're armed and carrying
certainly.
shields.
There's a Norse legend passed right the way down through to the 19th century people here of the Vikings first arriving in the island of Rousey and seeing the Picts like elves on the shore with shining spears and being too frightened to land the first time and going away again.
Once the Vikings came, almost all traces of the Pictish way of life seemed to vanish.
How do you know that this is a Viking rather than a Pictish house?
Well, Pictish house is a round, basically, made up of many small round rooms.
Right.
And this is like the houses that they came from in Norway.
So you find these back home?
Yeah, that's right.
Is there evidence of the Vikings coming in and coexisting, you know, living cheek by jowl with those who were already here?
The Pictish way of life was finished with once the Vikings came in.
Right.
Now,
how do you know that?
Because the houses don't continue to be lived in as houses, though some of the round houses are used as other things, you know, as outhouses or whatever.
Right. What about the women? Is there evidence that the Vikings brought their own girls from home, or did they just come as shiploads of men and marry locals?
No, they definitely have Norse women with them. We have straight Viking women's graves.
What does all your study and even your gut instinct tell you in terms of whether it was an assimilation and peaceful, or whether it was violent and more of a takeover?
It took them maybe a few decades, but I think the Picts left or were pretty well exterminated. That's what I think.
So Julie Gibson believes the Vikings brought their own women and the Picts were annihilated. But other experts aren't so sure. Some argue that while the Pictish men may well have been slaughtered, the Vikings spared their women and took them as wives. If they did, this will show up in genetic differences between today's Orcadian men and women. Here's how. We all inherit 23 chromosomes from each parent, which form our genetic blueprint. The last pair determines our gender. 2 X chromosomes if you're a girl, an X and Y if you're a boy. And the key to solving the mystery lies in the male Y chromosome.
This tiny slice of DNA, a small thing compared to the rest of the chromosomes in the human genome, is only passed down the male line. I have my dad's Y chromosome, just as he inherited his from his father, and so on back into my family's past. This legacy is the biological equivalent of a family heirloom, a watch or a ring, always passed down the male line.
This means that Sir Walter can distinguish male and female ancestry by looking at different bits of DNA. And in the case of the men and women living in Orkney today, can compare their genetic profile with that of the Vikings' closest living relatives, the Norwegians. While the team wrestle with their pipettes, I want to look at another compelling bit of evidence, which is the physical appearance of the islanders. The way we look, of course, is determined by genes handed down to us by our distant ancestors. The more geographically remote and stable a community, the clearer the signal. And the Orkney Islands are about as remote and stable as you can get. So let's look at some vital statistics. Around a third of people in Norway have blonde hair. Here in Orkney, around 1 in 5 people are blonde. That's twice as many as on the Scottish mainland. Likewise with blue eyes, which are a common Viking feature. 40% of people living here have blue eyes, compared with just 10% in northern Britain. So much for the hair and eyes. How about the physique? I'm off in search of a genuine ancient Norse Viking to see how strapping they really were. About 40 years ago, on this beach in Orkney, archaeologists excavated a Norse Age cemetery. It's eerie. It's a little bit sad as well. But even today, skeletons are still eroding out of the cliff face. What we're looking at here is part of the spinal column. That's vertebrae all in a row, still in their original positions. This is a rib curling round here. And down at this point is part of the pelvis. So there's a whole body, a whole skeleton, gradually being eaten out of here by the sea. One of the most amazing discoveries to come out of that excavation was the skeleton of a Norse boatman. And it still has a huge amount of information to tell us. Professor Taya Mollison from the Natural History Museum has analysed the bones of this fellow, who died around 800 years ago.
If you just look at sort of little details, for example, this is the breastbone. If you look at most of them, they're fairly parallel-sided. Whereas this one, it's expanded, and there's a muscle that attaches here that goes across the chest, which is really developed. In this case, I think he's using oars and going to sea as a fisherman.
So that already speaks of a hard life lived.
From a very early age, yes, pretty strenuous.
Wear and damage to these bones describe a life of harsh, grinding toil for this chap, and we can assume his fellow Nordic settlers. But, bad teeth aside, I wonder whether he would look out of place in a Kirkwall supermarket today. If this individual was stood before us now, what would he have looked like?
Possibly like you, only a bit older. Possibly even about the same height.
Right, so about 5'10".
Yeah, a bit taller than perhaps most of his countrymen.
How does he compare then physically to a modern inhabitant of Orkney?
Very similar. They're good, strong people, but usually pretty fit. So I think, yes, very similar.
The preponderance of blue-eyed blondes on the islands is a compelling bit of evidence. But are the islanders today tall and fit because they're descended from Vikings? Or simply because they eat better than their runty Pictish forebears? I'm turning to our face expert, Dr. Tony Little, to see what clues we can find in the facial features of today's Orcadians. Using the latest face recognition software, he's been able to compare a composite, typical Orcadian face with the Nordic equivalent.
So what's happening on the left-hand side of the screen is that each individual face is being morphed into the average shape from the Orkneys, and then each of those morphed shapes is being superimposed one on top of the other to create an average image.
Tony has identified some key features which are strikingly similar in the Norwegian and the Orkney faces.
You can see that it's characterised by having quite full lips, and it's also got quite a thin nose. And I think one striking thing about this image is that the jaw size, the chin size seems quite large.
But in the faces are clear differences too. The jaw is heavier in Orkney than in Norway, and the faces seem thicker set. The two faces are similar, but not identical. Will this be reflected in the DNA results? Another volunteer whose DNA is helping Sir Walter in his quest to find Viking blood is Jack Rendell. Rendell is an old Viking name, and Jack's family roots are firmly planted here at Rackwick on the island of Hoy. In fact, Jack still lives in a house dating back centuries, on the homestead occupied by his family as long as it's possible to tell. So Jack, do you remember the people who lived in these houses that we can see?
I can remember 35 people living there. I think there were about 28 houses when I was a wee boy. Well, there's still about 28 houses now, but most of them are holiday houses. And there are only 5 permanent residents.
On another branch of Jack's family tree is one of Scotland's most distinguished musicians, his cousin, Evelyn Glennie. Eager to know more about her Orkney roots,
Hello,
Evelyn is also taking part in the genetics study.
No, thank you.
So when did you last survey this scene?
Well, I think I may have been about 8 years old, 8 or 10 years old. So, you know, we're talking about probably just under 30 years now, a long time ago.
And how much do you know about your own family history related to this island?
Very little, other than the fact that there are many relatives here, and on my mother's side. And, you know, I've never really taken the time to follow our family tree, to delve into that, and I'm really eager to find out more.
The fact that our cousin Jack has an Old Norse surname suggests that Jack and Evelyn have Viking ancestry. But how strong is the Viking signal in their genes? Are they descended from a union between a Viking man and a Pictish woman? After a bit of genealogical spadework, I discover an important chapter in Jack and Evelyn's shared family history. A twist of fate 300 years ago, which should help us understand better the profile of their DNA.
Jack, can you explain just how you and Evelyn are related?
Well, we're related through the history of the wreck of the Crown. A ship that was wrecked off Dearness in 1679, I think.
Jack and Evelyn's ancestors were religious dissenters, so-called Covenanters, who fought for the rebellious Scottish Presbyterian cause. In 1679, they were captured and sentenced to spend the rest of their lives as slaves in the American colonies. They were packed onto a slave ship, which, on the 10th of December, reached Orkney in the eye of a storm. A monument marks the spot on the headland where the slave ship hit the rocks.
But the captain had ordered that the prisoners be locked in the hold. Some say that a crewman got back on board with a key and unlocked the hatches. Others say that he did it with an axe. But either way, his efforts meant that around 50 men managed to get up on deck and into the water and swam to shore. For the 200 left behind, it was a sad end. They all drowned. Of the 50 that made it ashore, most were recaptured and transported, so only a handful actually evade capture, and John Richardson is among them.
Wow.
And John made it to the village of Rackwick on Hoy, and the rest is your story.
That's incredible. I had no idea. I'm lost for words, actually. You know, I really am. It's incredible. It's quite moving. It really is.
But you wouldn't have a story, perhaps, at all, if you hadn't managed to do what you did.
It really is.
So you feel quite connected to that?
Yeah, I do. I do. It's a strange sort of feeling. You know, I didn't think, you know, I'd feel like this. You know, it's unbelievable. It really is. God.
Thompson and Richardson settled here and married local girls. But they weren't alone. When the Orkney Islands were handed over to the Scots in the 15th century, there were many others of Pictish descent who came here from the mainland and settled. In other words, the Viking genetic presence has been diluted considerably over the centuries by more and more Pictish DNA. 1,200 years later, will we find any trace of the Vikings at all? Sir Walter's team have finished their analysis. It's time to draw back the veil on the early, bloody history of these islands. I've come to the Orkney Islands to make history. Eminent geneticist Sir Walter Bodmer is examining DNA drawn from different parts of the country to shed some light on Dark Age Britain. His team have been in Orkney, hoping to answer a key question about the Viking invasion. Did the Viking warriors who came in their longboats come in large numbers? And did they bring their women with them? Or did the Vikings steal the wives and daughters of the local Pictish Celtic farmers? And were the Pictish men then slaughtered? Amazingly, the DNA of today's Orcadians holds the answer. If the Vikings settled down alongside the Picts, we would expect the Viking genetic imprint to be very much in the minority in today's population, especially since the Orkneys have been part of Scotland since the 15th century. And if the Vikings brought women, then any Viking signal should be roughly equal in both men and women living in the islands today. The results of the study are finally through. Sir Walter and his team have been examining the Y chromosome in the men on the islands. This chromosome is passed down the male line. Men in Norway and Sweden carry a distinctive Y chromosome inherited from their distant Viking predecessors. The key marker gene is known to geneticists as M17. By examining the frequency of this gene among the men in Orkney, Sir Walter can tell how many of them are descended from Viking males. Likewise, by looking for markers in the island women, Sir Walter can tell how many of them were descended from Viking women. After weeks of analysis, Sir Walter is ready at last to announce the results.
What we find there is if we just look at the Y chromosome, that mix is something like 55%. The male component comes from the Vikings.
Even after centuries of interaction with the Celtic mainland, more than half of Orkney's males can be directly linked to Norse Vikings. Together with the archaeological evidence, this strongly suggests that the Vikings overwhelmed the Pictish men when they invaded these islands, either slaughtering most of them or driving most of them out. But what about the women? Their results are enormously revealing. Only 1 in 10 Orcadian women is descended from a Viking woman. The female ancestors of the women on these islands were Pictish. Viking women must have been brought to Orkney over the years, but only in small numbers.
And that fits in with the notion that the initial invasions must have been by armies, and the armies were men. And many of the men will eventually have settled and taken on local wives.
The genes of today's Orcadians have a terrible, violent story to tell. The murdering and raping carried out by their male Viking ancestors is written into the DNA of today's population. The Norsemen ravaged these islands, driving out or slaughtering the Pictish men and taking their daughters and wives by force. But what about the individuals involved in the study? How will their stories conform to this general picture? Jean Flett has an ancient Viking surname, passed down the male side of the family. But what will her DNA reveal?
Hello?
Hello, is that Jean?
Yes, this is me.
Hello, Jean, it's Neil.
I've got Sir Walter with me.
Thank you.
Hello, Jean. We've got your results here from your sample of DNA.
For all her Viking name, Jean's genetic ancestry is overwhelmingly Celtic. The signal is 13 times more strongly Celtic than Norse. She may have had some distant male Viking ancestor, but there's little doubt he took for himself a Pictish woman.
It doesn't have anything to say that that is inconsistent with the fact that your ancestry goes back all that way in Orkney.
No. But my own theory is that the Vikings settled in and married in among the population.
Jack Rendell was born on the island of Hoy and also has an ancient Viking name. Jack's DNA results do indeed show that he has the M17 Norse marker, which means he can trace his male lineage all the way back to the Vikings who settled Orkney. But as his more recent family history suggests, there's also a strong Celtic component. The results for Evelyn Glennie, however, are surprising.
The results of your genetic test show that the people that you're descended from were Viking stock.
Although we know that Evelyn has some Pict genes in the mix, the Viking signal is very dominant in her genetic profile, which means by far the greater number of her ancestors were of Nordic origin.
Well, it's just been fascinating to find all of this out, you know, really fantastic.
The Genetics Project has opened a remarkable window on Orkney's turbulent history. The islands still bear a strong Viking hallmark, but they also reveal a lingering Celtic legacy, inherited in part from Pictish women who were among the original inhabitants of these islands. But when it comes to people who have invaded Britain, there is one lot who stand head and shoulders above the rest in our historical memory. For many of us, William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings in 1066 marks the beginning of British history proper. So, like William, I'm off to the southern coast of England in search of some of his Norman descendants.
The Norman conquest of 1066 was the last successful invasion of Britain. So I'm curious to find out how big a stamp the Norman invaders left on Anglo-Saxon England. So I'm heading down to the south coast to meet people who've taken part in the genetics study and to investigate the influence of the Norman invaders who settled there.
The southeast is, historically, about the busiest region of Britain. So it'll be interesting to see what lies hidden in the DNA of the volunteers from Kent and Sussex.
I think when you've researched the family, you feel closer to them, and you feel like you wish you had known them, but what were they doing 1,000 years ago?
On my father's side, they're farming and building, and then in the 1500s brewing, but I was born in Hastings, and therefore 1066 has perhaps even a bit more poignance to it. And I'd love to know whether I was Norman or Saxon.
My grandparents and my great-grandparents, I know they've been farmers, but apparently word has it that we were woodmen up in Scotland.
As a boy, I've heard my grandfather tell stories of the family, and it's another part of where we've come from. Been in East Kent since certainly the 17th century. Family tradition is that we are actually Flemish refugees.
While the Oxford team analysed the DNA samples, I'm off to do some digging around of my own. When the Normans arrived, Anglo-Saxon England was already well populated, and we know that the Normans didn't slaughter the Saxons. So, how many Normans came over, and what form did the conquest take? At the Norman castle in Lewis, I meet up with Professor David Carpenter.
You've got to think of a small group of elite conquerors. It's like a sort of corporate smash and grab raid in which a very small number of Normans seize all the wealth of England. They've expelled the Anglo-Saxon landowners. They've come to stay and think, how do we stay? We've got to physically get hold of the country, and they do that through their castles.
So is it all about inflicting their own culture on the place?
No, and if it had been, the Normans would never have stayed. They would never have survived. It was much more subtle than that. It's not like Iraq. Remember, the British and the Americans take over Iraq, the whole superstructure collapses. It's just anarchy. There was nothing like that in England because William the Conqueror was far too clever for that. He kept a large part of the English administrative structure, and so he was able to suck the wealth of England and take a lot of it back to Normandy. But also, in a more subtle way too, the Normans in a way then integrated into England. They almost become English.
But you don't have to find a Norman castle to explore the cultural impact of 1066, as I discovered over a working lunch with linguist Elaine Treharne.
How much does this plateful owe to France and the Normans?
Well, just the word plate, for a start, is Norman in origin. And looking at what we've got here, we've got this pastry, pasty type thing, both of which are French words. There are over 10,000 French words in English, at least 75% still in use from the medieval periods.
Given that the Normans were such a minority, why didn't they acquire more English?
Those who are in power or in control tend to have the greatest influence. From that point of view, as an English peasant, if you wanted to better yourself, you would have to learn some smattering of French in a kind of desire to be more like the person who's above you in the chain. So without even realising it, I think we are a kind of shopping basket of all kinds of different language ingredients, which has affected the way that we live and think and are able to describe things. Because I could say to you that, you know, this is jolly nice. And that sounds like the quintessential English phrase for things being pleasant, but pleasant itself is French, and so are the words jolly and nice.
The Normans, then, had an enormous impact on Britain. Our architecture, our language, our culture, even our nosh. But the big problem with the Normans is working out who they actually were. The name Norman comes from Norseman. It's a little-known fact, but William the Conqueror's army was of Viking origin. The Normans were descended from Norsemen, who grabbed the bit of French coast which is today Normandy. The trouble is, there are two kinds of Viking, both of whom were dubbed Norsemen in the early Middle Ages, but each with a different genetic profile. One bunch came from Norway. These Norwegian Vikings were, in genetic terms, the same gang that gave the Picts short shrift up in Orkney. The other crew came from Denmark. These, genetically, were the same as the Anglo-Saxons, who hailed from the same part of Europe only a couple of centuries earlier. So from which kind of Viking was William the Conqueror descended? Sir Walter is hoping to answer that question by looking into the DNA of people in Kent and Sussex. Meanwhile, I'm heading to East Kent for some more low-tech genealogy.
Looking through the Domesday Book, the great catalogue of land and ownership that William the Conqueror commissioned, it seems that Faversham is a good place to start. It's one place in England with very strong Norman connections. In fact, Domesday Book shows that William kept Faversham for himself, and when this was put together, the place was valued at the princely sum of £80.
One of the reasons that William took a shine to Faversham was oysters. Like city bankers today, the Normans loved their oysters. So much so that King Stephen, William's grandson, founded the oyster fishery. Ian Dane takes me out to the oyster beds that his family have worked for centuries. He believes the celebrated crustacean is what links his family with William the Conqueror.
In the time, say, of King Stephen, were they just naturally occurring?
Yes.
We weren't farming them as
so.
such?
No, we weren't farming them as such then. What we would have been doing was on the spring tides, literally raking the oysters from knee to waist deep in water.
And what can you get here with that rake that you're wielding?
Would be cockles, actually.
It's like gardening.
There's the very fellas. Ian's father, Gordon Dane, is taking part in the genetic study. He's keen to find out how Norman or Anglo-Saxon or Celtic he is. And for many generations, the Dane men have been working for the Faversham Oyster Company, reputedly the oldest company in the world.
It must be tempting to think that the family connection to the Oyster Company goes all the way back.
I'm absolutely certain that it does. I hope that my lineage is traced back, as my grandfather said it would be, to Norman times. He always said that the Danes were the oldest family in this part of England.
So Gordon and his family have the aphrodisiac oyster in common with William the Conqueror. But has Sir Walter found Norman genes to match? After weeks of exhaustive analysis, his team have some results. Sir Walter has been unable to find any genetic sign of the Norse Vikings. The results clearly suggest that the Normans who conquered Britain were of Danish Viking origin. It also indicates that the conquerors, who found it so easy to assimilate with the Saxons, were in fact of the same genetic stock. In the population of the south coast, it is simply impossible to tell them apart.
I think we can say that it's very unlikely that those Normans had a major contribution of the Norse Vikings, the ones that we would associate with Norway and Sweden, because our particular Y chromosome differences that we use to make that distinction, those aren't there in the Normans. All the evidence is that the Normans were essentially Danish Vikings.
But the DNA results have turned up something else. 30% of the regional genetic profile is Celtic, a strong genetic echo of the original hunter-gatherers who first settled Britain. It would appear that as we get further from the east coast of England, the Anglo-Saxon signal weakens and the Celtic signal strengthens. So how about Gordon Dane? Where does he fit into this picture? Coming from a long line of Faversham oystermen, he harbours dreams of being a Norman conqueror. But what will his DNA show?
If we take Anglo-Saxon, and that's a broad term, you're 6.5 times more likely to be Anglo-Saxon than of Celtic origin.
So there's no sign of Celtic ancestry in Gordon. He's either Norman or Saxon.
My only disappointment, possibly, is that I was trying to look for something more definite, tying their family in with the Normans.
I think what one has to remember is the Anglo-Saxons came from Denmark. The Danish Vikings also came from that area. And, of course, the Normans were essentially Danish Vikings. They came all from the same area, so they were the same people.
In the area where I live, there are loads of places named after the Danes, or with Dane in the name, and they seem to spring from the Norman invasion, and so obviously we're hoping that we can be traced back into that era.
Well, that certainly fits with this.
Well, I think it's great. Fantastic, actually.
Sir Walter's genetic map is beginning to reveal clearly defined regions. Anglo-Saxon in the east, Celtic in the west, Norse Viking in the northernmost tip of Britain. But where does that leave the rest of England? The big bit in the middle, which has been subject to influences from all sides. Sir Walter is looking to Oxfordshire, where, as it were, east meets west, to take the genetic temperature of Middle England.
But the results in Oxfordshire, we think, are remarkably clear-cut in terms of the balance between the Celtic representation from Devon, Cornwall and Wales and the Anglo-Saxon represented by East Anglia, Norfolk, Suffolk and Lincolnshire. And our estimate there is that it's about 51% Celts. And I think that really does fit in with the pattern of history as we see it.
The big result then is this. The Oxfordshire figures suggest that we British are still, for the most part, a pretty equal mix of Anglo-Saxon and ancient Celt, with some Danish Viking and, in the far north, a dash of Norwegian Viking. Of course, our great island story has a number of subplots. For centuries, there have been other genetic influences, from Jews, Protestant Huguenots and others. But more than this, in the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain became the world's first great industrial nation, with trading links and a great empire stretching across the world. So what impact has this had on the modern face of Britain? As testing continues around the country, Sir Walter's DNA map of Britain will gather even more detail. But time is running out. The world is shrinking. 21st century life is becoming ever more mobile and cosmopolitan. Our genetic roots are becoming increasingly tangled and impenetrable. In 20 years, a project like this will probably be impossible.
I think a large part of the fascination for me is simply that this is the last chance. It's now or never.
Absolutely. I think we're really quite on the cusp, the margin of being able to do this even now. And that comes with the mobility of the trains, the motor car, the planes, people living all over the place. You know, we're going to be a global village eventually. And who knows in 100 years' time what sort of a mix there'd be. And so the opportunities for looking back in this way are rapidly disappearing.
The Battle of Hastings unleashed the last continental conquest of Britain. But almost 1,000 years have passed since then, and they've witnessed regular influxes of new people, immigrants to Britain from every corner of the globe.
In the 19th century, Britain became the world's first and greatest industrial power, the workshop of the world. London was, and arguably remains, the world's financial capital, and it opened its doors to the world.
No other city in Europe has as much genetic diversity as London. Nearly 300 different languages are spoken. As much as 30% of London's population is made up of minority ethnic groups, and every major world religion is practiced here.
But as local historian David Mander points out, for Hackney at least, this is nothing new. Kingsland Road, which runs south to the city, dates back to antiquity.
It does feel today as though almost every population on the planet's represented.
It's a pattern set down 2,000 years ago. We are standing just off a road that was built by the Romans and would have seen a diversity of people from all over the empire as soldiers and traders using it.
At what point do we start to see the real mixing that's going on today?
It's after the Second World War, and it's two stages. It's in this area where we are now in Dalston, it's the Caribbean population who start to come in from the later 1950s. Then you start to get other waves of people, for example, Turkish people who have a mosque presence at one end of the Kingsland Road. There's the West African presence that started from the 1980s onwards, followed by the Vietnamese communities, and the first refugees came over after the collapse of South Vietnam.
So there's a powerful magnet here that has drawn people and still does.
Yes, and that will be true for the new populations coming in, the people from Poland and Russia, who are actually beginning to form the next wave.
So far in this series, we've created 14 typical faces, representing different regions in Britain. But with these islands becoming ever more mixed, is it possible to create a new face that accurately represents the whole of Britain today? We asked Dr. Tony Little. Armed with statistics from the 2001 census, many hundreds of digital photographs and the latest face recognition technology, he has created, for the first time, a composite, modern face of Britain, male and female. And here they are.
The faces that we've been looking at have been the product of much older blood, older migrations, older invasions. This is a more realistic representation of the face of a multicultural Britain.
I agree, and I think it'll be very interesting to see how the face of Britain changes in the future.
The blood flowing in our veins reveals that the British stock has had remarkable continuity. Amazingly, most of us still carry DNA brought to these shores by those first hunter-gatherers who colonised our islands 10,000 years ago. But as our Oxford study shows, others have contributed to our genes. Anglo-Saxons and Vikings didn't just bring their culture. In some parts of Britain, they left a deep genetic footprint. In truth, the populations of these islands are constantly being regenerated by the arrival of new people, all of them contributing to the ever-changing face of Britain.